Okay. Thank you all. It is our pleasure that Stan and Susan McCracken are able to come in here today and do a follow-up to your other DSM-5 presentation that you did a year and a half ago, something like that?
Was it the anticipating?
Yeah, the anticipating one, right. We are all anticipating the DSM-5, and at the end of this presentation, we're going to talk about how we're going to drill this down. This is the first of many things that we're going to be doing to learn this material. So thank you very much.
Cool. And there is a live feed to the NSA. Just, you know, in full disclosure. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Stan McCracken, and we're here to talk about DSM-5. By virtue of the fact that you're all here, you meet the essential feature for DSM-5 implementation anxiety disorder. So, kind of set the context here. How many of you went to the anticipating DSM-5? How many of you? Oh my Lord! Okay, that met the essential feature for DSM-5 anticipation obsessive compulsive disorder. So. Okay, we're going to talk about the process of revision and structural, conceptual cross-cutting changes. There were a lot of what we talked about they ended up doing, but they are set on a course now that is likely to continue and expand until there's a major change in the way we think about that, and we'll say more about that as we go along. We're going to be talking about some specific diagnostic groupings and go into some detail about the changes. One of the things is if anybody is preparing for a licensing exam in social work, now psychology is changing October 1st, right? They're changing their licensing exam on October 1st, but social work supposedly won't be changing the licensing exams until the first of the year, or not before the first of the year. I haven't heard a specific date yet. There's lots of rumors. And there are enough differences between this one, that the DSM-5 and DSM-4, just kind of be aware that there are some big changes. So if anyone's preparing for any licensing exams. This is a citation of the manual. And what we recommend is that make sure that you have access to this, okay, the full manual. There are some other documents. I mean, here's the reference, the DESC criteria. All these are the diagnostic criteria. It doesn't describe the disorders, it just lists the criteria. There's a lot of information in this that isn't in one of these other manuals. And one of the things, by the way, I have to say, I'm really happy that this is purple. I mean, seriously, gray? Really? Gray? That's the best you can do? And both Susan and I were very happy that this wasn't black, because there's too much confusion between the Bible and... So, a couple other things that you might be interested in. There's a pocket guide to the DSM-5 diagnostic exam, and Susan really is the person who alerted me to how valuable this was, and I actually used it with my class last year. There's a 30-minute diagnostic interview that's outlined here, but this is actually not bad. You might want to think about maybe whether it'd be useful to have a copy of this floating around someplace. It costs, like everything else with the DSM, it costs way too much. So, you know, and I thought that they might actually have an app for that. What they have, honest to God, for those of you who are real DSM-5 nerds, this is an app. And if you're interested in seeing it, I'll be happy to show it to you. But there is an app for that. I'm not sure what it costs now. What it used to cost was around, $60 or so. So it costs as much as the actual paper version. But there are there's some little, a couple short, like 2-minute videotapes of things on there where it's talking heads, people discussing the criteria in a very serious voice. So anyway, that's the manual. This is the first major revision in 30 years, okay? Now, let's get a show of hands here. How many people practiced under DSM-4 TR? Raise your hand. Everybody's hand should go up. Good. How about DSM-4? DSM-3R, DSM-3, DSM-2. Just the two of us? Okay. One time we had someone who practiced under DSM-1, and he actually did a pretty good job of staying awake for much of the presentation. You know, those of us who practiced under DSM-2 will remember that DSM-2 is basically one step removed from phrenology. I mean, it was like, you know, little bumps on the head. When DSM-3 came out, and one of the things I find amusing, for those of you who may have been following some of the blogs and discussion in the New York Times and New Yorker and all these things, you know, periodically I would see something written by an author who was the chairman of one of the other task forces and talking about what a great thing DSM-3 was. Excuse me, I was practicing in 1980 when DSM-3 came out. The notion that that was enthusiastically received is a load of crap, because I remember hearing people talk about the DSM-3 and they were not happy. I remember, specifically, I remember one psychiatrist and analyst at the University of Chicago who was kind of grumping around, and he was saying, "Oh, this Chinese menu approach to diagnosing," and did a kind of a Richard Nixon impression. And you know, the idea that you would have specific concrete criteria, that was not well received. So there's been a lot of the things that people have been writing and saying is kind of like, well, I think that there may either be some early onset of what's now called neurocognitive disorder, or that they weren't around for that. But this is the first major revision. Between 1980 and now, what they've mainly done is tinkered with criteria, added disorder, subtracted disorder. They've started making some conceptual shifts here that are probably going to continue until we have a system that's based on biology. And a couple of the big shifts, one of the big ones is thinking about this more dimensionally and less categorically, and I'll say more about that later. Both the DSM and the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, is being revised. At the same time, they're continuing to make these compatible. The problem, of course, is that it's hard to talk about cross-national patterns of psychiatric disorders when you're using different way of diagnosing between the two. And so there are disorders in ICD that are not in the DSM. For example, neurasthenia is something that's not in the DSM but is an ICD. And has anyone recently diagnosed anyone with athacastic personality disorder? Not so much. That's very similar to obsessive compulsive disorder, or obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So there are unfortunately, sometimes even when they're called the same thing, the criteria are different. So that if you, thinking about diagnostic criteria in DSM, thinking that's going to map directly on the same disorder in ICD is not always correct. At the same time that these two are being revised, the National Institute on Mental Health is putting together some research domain criteria. These are criteria, diagnostic criteria, that are based on brain biology and genetics. Now, how this is going to be used initially is to start with research. The likelihood that this is going to affect clinical practice, my guess is that we're at least a decade, maybe two away from that, and here's the reason. When's the last time any of you sent a client out to get brain image to establish a psychiatric disorder? Has anyone done that in the last year? You know, this is a problem. It's not available to people in general practice, so having something based on brain biology is not going to be terribly useful. There are a few things, though, some biological things that might affect us that are based on things like galvanic skin response and pupil change, things that you can do basically with an iPhone and a sensor that might start creeping in. But the idea that we're going to be basing diagnosis on biology, certainly before I retire, completely retire, is highly unlikely. Both the American Psychiatric Association and World Health Organization are committed to making these living documents. What that means is that as research comes in, they will be making changes in the diagnostic criteria. Probably will first be published online, okay? so that we're going to have DSM 5.1 and 5.2 and all of these. Final draft approved December 2012, released in May of 2013. Some of the criticisms and controversies, in my opinion, there are three clusters of criticisms. The first cluster of criticisms are legitimate criticisms. There are some problems with this. There's some things that they did in the DSM-5 that I think that were probably mistakes. There were things that they didn't do that I think should have been done. And there are things that they did, especially with regard to some of the developmental stuff, that they should have done years ago. So some of the criticisms are well-founded. There's another set of criticisms that are based on lack of knowledge of what the current manual is about. You've probably heard a lot about the eliminating the bereavement exclusion. Excuse me, there never has been a bereavement exclusion, and we'll say more about that later. And the idea, and so when they talk a lot about that stuff, there wasn't one, okay? So there are some criticisms that are based on not knowing what the current manual is like. The third cluster, a lot of these are criticisms that are raised by people who chaired past work groups and chaired past revisions, and can we all spell narcissistic injury? Some of the criticisms, though, one, further movement towards a medical model, pathology-based and not strength-based, and that's been true forever. And my feeling is, and we were talking about this before, my feeling is that we need to really rethink the degree to which we should be basing treatment on a diagnosis in the first place, as opposed to goals, problems, values, and some other things that probably make a lot more sense for a lot of the stuff that we do. And that's a conversation I think that we need to be having is should we really, as non-physicians, be basing our treatment and research on diagnosis. Insufficient support from clinical trials. The disorders were tested in a number of clinical trials. Some of the disorders that were initially proposed and things that we actually talked about the last time that we were here ended up not making it in because they didn't do very well in clinical trials. Even some of the disorders that made it into the manual didn't do enormously well in clinical trials. So what a lot of people have criticized that there really, even for some of the disorders, that there still isn't enough support for the utility of these. Diagnoses and criteria are not based on genetics or pathophysiology. They never have been. Okay, for our system, they've always been based on phenomenology, what people tell us, signs and symptoms. And the problem is that our current diagnoses don't map very well onto brain biology. And so, for example, let's take schizophrenia, for instance. Schizophrenia is probably a cluster of biological, if you think biology, we're probably talking about a cluster of disorders. And the problem is that, that there are a number of disorders that can share the same symptoms. So it's not based on genetics and pathophysiology, the brain biology. Eventually it probably will be. Concerns about overdiagnosing, overprescribing. Okay, let's be clear. There is no way that you can put together a diagnostic classification system that compensates for sloppiness and rushing through something. So a lot of these concerns about overdiagnosing or overprescribing have less to do with the manual per se than with how it's used and with people rushing through things. And I've read enough clinical charts to know that it doesn't matter what profession somebody is, they can still rush through a diagnosis and not do a very good job. So, but that's one of the concerns. This is one that has come up, and I'm guessing now, how many of you, are any of you working in the early childhood program? Yeah, I'm betting you'll hear a bunch about this. Advocacy groups, especially around the autism spectrum disorders and the shift there and elimination of Asperger's, and Susan will be saying a fair amount about that. Disapproval, you will know it when you see it. Oh. Okay, so what does it look like? First of all, we don't have any more axes. So we just list the diagnostic codes. The order in which you list the codes is going to depend on the form that you're handed. So you don't differentiate or distinguish between what we now call Axis 1, Axis 2, or the Axis 3 medical, general medical conditions or other medical conditions as they're referred to in DSM-5. There are still V codes, and these will be called Z codes in ICD-10. for 3 sections. Section 1, it looks very much the same as it does now. It's basically how do you use the manual, cautionary statement about forensic use. Section 2, that's where most everything is. The bulk of the manual is in Section 2, and that's where the disorders are described, and there's a lot of information. We'll tell you, talk about what's in there for that. And by the way, for those of you who are wearing bifocals like me, you're going to look at this and you're going to think, do I need new glasses? No. Susan was reading this and thought, this looks smaller. So she compared the font between DSM-4 TR and DSM-5. And yes, dear friends, they have made the font smaller. It's like when I give an assignment with a maximum of 6 pages and the students hand in something with no margins and 5-point font. You know, the font is a lot smaller with this one, so you don't need new glasses. Well, maybe you need new glasses, but that's not an indicator. Section 3, emerging measures and models. Assessment measures are discussed here. Cultural formulation is discussed there. Conditions for further study. That's the one, so when we talk about a certain disorder was placed in Section 3, that means it was placed in this section called conditions for future study. Okay, or further study, I should say. And that's how we'll mainly be using that. Appendices, highlights of changes from 4 to 5, glossary of technical terms. By the way, there are no more, the list, remember they used to have a list of defense mechanisms. It doesn't mean defense mechanisms are no longer used, they're just not in the DSM-5. No more Roman numerals. They're switched to Arabic numerals. Why? Because Roman numerals don't have decimal points. And when you talk about 5.1, 5.2, that doesn't work with Roman numerals. And so that changes will probably be referred to this way. Probably will be put out first in electronic versions. Severity scales are much more specific. Since we don't have Axis 5, which, by the way, in my opinion, didn't work very well anyway, because you combined symptom distress or severity of symptoms with impaired functioning, and anybody who's been in the field very long has seen people where that doesn't go together very well, that people are going to work every day and then you say, well, do people know at work that you're depressed and thinking about suicide? Oh no, people at work don't know, you know, and vice versa. So they've gotten rid of that, but they have a number of assessment tools, and we're going to talk a bit about those because there are lots of them. Now, they're discussed in the DSM, but they're not in the DSM. They're online in PDF files. These are the assessment tools for adults. These are the assessment tools for children and adolescents. And they are PDF files. The copyright allows you to print them out. You can go on, click the PDF file, print it out, use it with your clients. It's okay to use them. What the copyright doesn't allow is for me to make a copy of it and give them to you or to distribute them to you electronically. But they are free, they're available online, and there are lots of them, and we'll say something about that. Suicide risk is something, remember in DSM-4, basically suicide risk was discussed with mood disorders, it was discussed with schizophrenia, borderline personality, and maybe 1 or 2 others. It's discussed with virtually every disorder now. So suicide risk, they talk a lot about that. Cultural formulation and structured interview in Section 3. Now, how many of you have seen, now starting with DSM-4, they recommended putting a cultural formulation and using that. How many of you have seen a psychiatric evaluation with a cultural formulation in it? Exactly. One of the problems, now there are a couple problems. Number one, I think people didn't take it seriously. Number two, they told us what we needed to put in it, but they didn't tell us how to ask the questions. How do you ask a question to get at this information? In DSM-5, they actually have some some structured interviews that will help you to elicit information that you would put in a cultural formulation, and we'll say more about that in a bit. APA, when it came out, recommended implementation early in 2014. As far as I know, Illinois DMH has still not decided on an implementation date. The work group was only formed a few months ago about implementation. I've heard rumors, you know. Heard rumors. I heard one rumor about July 1st. Well, that didn't happen. I've heard a rumor about October 1st this year for DMH. I've heard a rumor about January 1st. Susan is in private practice, and one of the managed care companies said that they will be switching to DSM-5 on October 1st. It's a big company. My hunch is that now that the dam is broken, my guess is that there may be some others that follow suit. I thought that probably what would happen is that when Medicare said, okay, here's when we're going to implement it, that everybody would follow suit. But I still haven't heard anything, and I don't think, has anybody else heard anything about an official date? I've heard rumors, but so we don't know when it's going to be implemented. Both ICD-9 and, okay, you probably know that the codes that you use, these 5-digit codes, you know, 296.30 and all of that, those are technically not DSM codes. Technically, those are ICD codes. That's where they come from. They're in the DSM, but they originate in the ICD. The codes that we're currently using are ICD-9-CM. We're going to be switching to ICD-10, and I'm guessing that you probably heard that October 1st of 2014 we were going to switch. The physicians, the American Medical Association, or a group of physicians within that, raised a big stink. A bill came out of House Ways and Means, passed at the U.S. Senate, putting off implementation of ICD-10 to not before October 1st of 2015. So it's been pushed back a year for implementation of the codes. The DSM-5 lists ICD-9, and then the ICD-10 codes are in parentheses. Do you have that packet? There is a packet online that we gave to Charlotte, and she's going to make available. There is something that's available that lists the codes. It's the DSM-5 diagnosis, okay, not DSM-4, but DSM-5 diagnosis, and then they list both the ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes. Now, you can do that by looking up the diagnosis in DSM-5, but this is something that's a little more convenient here. Okay. Well, go ahead.
Oh, well, this is weird.
This is weird. Okay, there we go.
I'm sorry. I think the important thing is this lists all the disorders alphabetically. And if you've looked at some of those crosswalks, it doesn't, and you can't find it's not a direct route from looking from the left to the right. What was, what is, what's going to be. This is, you just find the alphabetical. Once you've made your diagnosis, look for it in alphabetical order, and then right next to it you'll see the ICD-9, which is essentially DSM-4TR, and then you'll see the ICD-10 code.
What was, what is, and what shall become. That sounds just way too biblical for me. I don't know. By the way, if you get crosswalks that go between DSM-4 and DSM-5, I would avoid those because they don't really work. I do some consulting to the Division of Alcoholism, Illinois DASA, okay? And they were talking about, well, what should we do about a crosswalk? And I said, don't do it, because there are some disorders that you can translate. Okay, yeah, this is that, and that's. There are a lot of them that just doesn't work. The way that you need to, when it comes time to switch, the way that you need to do this, and it'll become really clear as we go along, make a diagnosis, identify the specifier, look up the code, okay? If you try to do shortcuts, sometimes that's not going to work, and if you ever get audited, you're going to be toast. So just a word to the wise is avoid the crosswalks, because the likelihood someone's going to be able to put one together that actually works very well is just, it's very slim. But the coding, the letters, and looking up the numbers, that will work well. For now, continue to use ICD-9-CM, the numbers only. ICD-10 uses a letter and number. The specific code, though, will depend on the specifier. And then, remember I said that they were doing ICD-11? They've now pushed the date back to 2016. Anyone want to guess when ICD-10 was written? 1992. And now they're talking about implementing it just now. So when are they going to switch over to ICD-11? Who knows? Okay. These are the websites. The main one's www.psychiatry.org/DSM-5. What that does is that will take you to, and I'll show you the web page in a little bit, but that'll take you to a table of contents and a place where you can access the assessment tools, and then some changes and corrections. By the way, there are errors in the DSM-5. Most of them are cut and paste errors. Okay, and anybody who's ever done much writing and done any cut and pasting will recognize those kind of stupid mistakes because we all make them. Like one place it has, it's a differential diagnosis with delusional disorder. It says that if the person has delusions, you're not supposed to diagnose delusional disorder. Okay, how does that work? So that was clearly a cut and paste. There are a couple of substantive errors that are in there that actually are not good. So anyway, as they correct these errors, and there's also information on translations, so that as they're translating like the tools and all that, there's information there.
Are you going to mention the errors or look online for the errors?
Yeah, that's that page. Yeah,
All right.
yeah. The errors are online, and they'll talk about what they've corrected. There are no more NOS diagnoses. Okay. Instead, we have other specified and other unspecified disorders. Other specified disorders is where you're able to indicate a particular disorder is in this category, and here's what's going on and why it doesn't meet the criteria for anything that's already listed. So, for example, suppose you were seeing someone that had all of the symptoms required to make a diagnosis of major depression, but they've had several episodes that were 10 days long. They never did have one that was the full 2 weeks required of duration criteria to make the diagnosis. What you can say then is other depressive disorder, sufficient number of symptoms, insufficient duration. And that would be an other specified disorder that you could do. Other unspecified is basically a way to tell people this person has a disorder that's in this group, but I'm not going to provide further information. Probably that's mostly going to be used when you need to get more information. So suppose that you're talking with someone, and let's say you're in an emergency room, the person is very depressed, obviously has all the symptoms, but they have psychomotor retardation and it's hard to even have a conversation. So finding out about how long they've had it, etc., you're going to have to go out and talk to a family member or get records. Then you could use other depressive disorder, other unspecified depressive disorder. So we don't use NOS anymore. They do still allow provisional diagnoses. One of the things you're going to notice about DSM-5, and for those of you who've looked at that, there are lots of specifiers. Oh my God, so many specifiers. That's one of the things that, for all the disorders, and we'll run through some of those. These are the diagnostic groupings, and I just listed the groupings that are in there so that you won't have to look them up online. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you're saying unspecified is when you need more information and you can't get it in the moment?
Well, it means, what it says is that the disorder that we're seeing is in this group, but I'm not going to say any more about why it doesn't meet the criteria or what's going on. Probably what I think is going to happen is that people are likely to use that mostly when they need more information. But it doesn't say that, it's not specifically telling you that you need more information. It just says I'm not going to tell you any more about it.
So here's the second question. Can you only use other specified or other unspecified for short periods of time?
That's a question for your funder, I'm guessing, your managed care and whoever provides the funding. There isn't any, the DSM doesn't say anything about that. That's not there, so that's probably a question that's probably a little further up the feeding chain. So probably is going to have to do a lot with your funder or with the administration or who you're working with. Yeah. Okay, so those are groupings. Now, here's the information that's provided, and then when we get through this, you'll see why we recommend that you actually get a copy of it. There's a lot of information. First of all, we have the diagnostic criteria with recording and recording procedures for both ICD-9 and ICD-10. That's the same as it was before. It has it lists the criteria to make the diagnosis. Diagnostic features. This is a description of symptoms. This is what people are likely to tell you when they come in and see you. And one of the things that they do a nice job with, they talk about what the diagnoses will look like at different ages. And Susan's going to talk about some of the developmental issues because they did a nice job with some of that. Associated features supporting the diagnoses. Are there other signs, symptoms, laboratory tests that might provide information that would go along with this diagnosis? Prevalence. Remember in DSM-4 they talked about the rate of disorders primarily in the U.S. and in different settings. So they talk about, for instance, dementia or delirium is a good example of that. They talk about delirium, the prevalence in a nursing home, the prevalence in an ICU unit, the prevalence in surgery, the prevalence in, so they talk about what is the rate, the likelihood that you'll see this condition in different settings. In DSM-5, they also have a lot of information for some disorders about what does this look like around the world. So what is the prevalence of major depression like in Africa? What is the prevalence of schizophrenia in Southeast Asia? So they have different parts of the world. Western Europe, sometimes they'll have it for Africa or Asia or South America. So they will have prevalence rates sometimes, not always, but for some disorders they have prevalence rates in different parts of the world. They also have prevalence rates very often for different age groups. So is the prevalence rate in teens different than it is for adults or older adults? By gender, they'll list prevalence rates very often by gender. Remember in DSM-4, basically a lot of the prevalence of where gender was around major depression and alcohol dependence disorder. So they have those different gender rates for different disorders. Development and course, onset, development, remission, recurrence, factors related to that, and Susan will be talking a bit about that, more about that later. Risk and prognostic factors. Are there conditions that contribute to the onset, recurrence, remission of different disorders? And again, Susan will say more about that. Culture-related diagnostic issues. This is actually pretty cool. For some areas, they have extended discussions of culture. So for instance, when they talk about brief psychotic disorder, they go into a lot of detail about trance states and possession and all of that. So they'll talk about are there some things that you might see in different cultures, or are there some factors that might influence a diagnosis in different cultures? Gender-related diagnostic issues, same thing. Are there differences between how this might appear according to gender? Suicide risk, as we mentioned, is discussed for most disorders. Functional consequences. How does having a particular disorder impact functioning, and functioning at different ages and different contexts? Like how does it impact if you're in school? How might it impact on the job? So caring for kids. Differential diagnosis, and again, this is pretty much the same as it was in DSM-4. And then finally, comorbidity, and this is a new section. So what is the likelihood that a person with a particular disorder will be diagnosed with another psychiatric or medical condition? And this is something that, so for instance, if you have someone with bipolar disorder, what's the likelihood that they may also have a substance use disorder of some kind? So there's a lot of stuff on comorbidity that wasn't in DSM-4. So again, there's a lot of stuff. Some of it's the same kind of information, but there's a lot of stuff that's new. Okay. Categorical and dimensional. This is the change that is likely to set off on a path that's likely to be continued. You know, the disorders and the criteria, those are going to change. This is probably the only way it's going to change most likely is it's going to be emphasized even more. In a categorical approach to diagnosis, if you look at a distribution of people with a diagnosis, what you would see is that ideally there's no overlap, like tuberculosis or pneumococcal pneumonia. You know, you either have the bacterium or you don't. Or it's like being a little bit pregnant. No, I'm sorry, you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant, okay? So the question is there a clear point of rarity? That is a place where these two don't intersect, okay? Well, the problem is in our field is it looks a lot more like this. So that there's a lot of overlap. So does this person, do they have a major depressive disorder and they're also highly anxious, or do they have a generalized anxiety disorder and because they've been anxious so long they're now getting depressed and they have some symptoms of depression? Which one of these, okay? And that's pretty common in our field. So that's the question. Now, the interesting thing since DSM-3, since 1980, there's a statement, a very clear statement in Section 1 that says there is no assumption of a distinct difference between people having one disorder and another, or between people having no disorder and a psychiatric disorder. They say that very clearly in the first part of the manual, and then they act like there is in the rest of the manual. So they talk about things as though they're very different, and really not so much. You know, there's a lot of overlap. There's overlap in symptoms, there's comorbidity, there's a lot of stuff going on. And the dimensional approach is we think about one or more quantitative scales that are continuous with normal and other conditions. So for example, for those of us who use the same kind of hair color that I do, you probably remember that your primary care doc or then general practitioner used to have a heart-to-heart with you if your cholesterol was over 220, okay? Then it switched down to primary care docs we're talking to if it's over 200, and now it might even be lower where they'd have that serious talk. So what's happened? The dividing line between something that's clinically of a concern and not of concern is shifting. It's gradually moving down. That's very characteristic of dimensional approaches to diagnosis, and that's true of blood pressure, of glucose levels for diabetes, and to talk about pre-diabetic states. And the question in a dimensional approach is, where do we put the dividing line? Okay? So in DSM-5, there's been a big movement towards this dimensional approach because what we found out and what we've learned is that a categorical approach just doesn't work very well for psychiatric disorders. So disorders in several groups are discussed as spectrum disorders: autism spectrum disorders, schizophrenia spectrum disorders, major and mild neurocognitive disorders. So they talk about dimensions for a number of disorders. The likelihood is that that's going to continue, okay? I put Red Bull in my coffee this morning instead of water, and now I can see noises. Okay, dimensional assessment. Okay, the assessment measures are placed in they're discussed in Section 3. This is a link to get to them, and basically that's so darn small you can't hardly read it. Just go to dsm5.org psychiatry.org/dsm5, and it'll take you to a screen where you can get that. The cross-cutting symptom measures, the first are the level 1 and level 2. Now, I'm guessing that for most of your programs, this is not going to be a huge issue. Where this is mainly the level 1 assessment is a screening. And it's the assessment that they used is based, looks to me like it's based on the mini international neuropsychiatric interview, the mini screen. Because the items are almost identical, the layout is almost identical. And it's a brief survey of 13 domains for adults and 12 symptom domains for children and adolescents, children from 6 to 17. And this is a listing of the domains for adults, and this is a listing of the domains for children and adolescents. And where this is mostly going to be useful is like in primary care, juvenile justice and criminal justice settings. It would also be useful in senior centers. It'll be mainly useful in a place where people are not coming in because they already know that there's something going on. So if you have a mental health center, that's why people are there. So you'd want to go to the full diagnostic interview. But if you are in a primary care setting, some people are going to have some symptoms that we need to attend to, and a lot of people won't. So with the level 1, the screening items, it's designed, by the way, to be on a single sheet of paper, so you can copy it front and back. Or you can put it on a computer screen. So it's self-report for adults. For kids from 11 to 17, they have a self-report version, and they have a parent version for 6 to 17. So for the whole range of kids, they have a parent version, and for the older kids, they have a self-report. Items are rated on a 5-point scale from none or not at all, 0, none, or not at all the way up to 4, severe nearly every day. If items are rated more than mild, or in some cases more than slight, for suicidal, psychosis, substance use, or inattention, or yes or don't know, then that would trigger a further assessment with a relevant level 2 measure. So the level 1, if you screen positive, and let me show you. So here's a screenshot of the level 1 measure. Little interest or pleasure in doing things, feeling down, depressed, or hopeless. What are they screening for there? Yeah, depression. Yeah, screening for depression. So if the person screens above like a 3 or a 4 on either one of these, then that would trigger, you could give the person a level 2 measure. Now, if someone died and made meat a king, what I would say is if someone screens positive, they probably should be evaluated by a mental health professional. But, you know, in some settings they'll do it, in some settings they won't. But that would then trigger this level 2 assessment. Feeling more irritated, grouchy, or angry than usual, what's that screening for? Having to come to a DSM-5 presentation on a Friday morning, okay? And so these are the items. This is the first batch of them. Notice that they also have some questions about drug use. Yes?
Why are they different colors, though?
My guess is that they did that for the domains. So that you notice this first set here, this is depressive domain, sleeping less but having lots of energy, starting more projects than usual, or doing more risky things, screening for mania. So the different colors, and then you notice that they're blocked, okay? So that means what you would see over in that far side that I didn't put on there is what the level 2 assessment is, okay? And they also, again, have this questions about drug, alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs use. Here's one for kids. The parent or guardian rated level 1. Complained of stomach aches, headaches, or other aches and pains. Said he or she was worried about health or getting sick. What are they screening for here? Having a quiz today in stool. Okay. So this is the screening for children and adolescents. And again, 13 domains for adults and 12 for children and adolescents. That's level 1. Level 2 is more detailed clinical inquiry. And again, the level 2 is to assist in making a diagnosis. Okay, I'll say more about why that, I'm distinguishing that in a minute. But these are the level 2 measures that are currently available for adults: anger, mania, anxiety, and you can see all these. For children, self-report and parent guardian, somatic symptoms, sleep disturbance, etc. Not currently, there aren't any currently available for psychosis, repetitive thoughts or behavior, suicidal ideation, or suicide attempts. So these are the level 2, and again, the goal is to help you make a diagnosis. The next, here's the one for level 2 children, and this is 11 to 17, so this would be a self-report. Okay, and again, if you want to look at those, we've got them all printed out, and they're in our binders over there. So I couldn't stop feeling sad. I felt alone, felt everything in my life went wrong. So that they're basically walking people through, you know, where the symptoms there. This one I feel is a particularly sensitive instrument to assess irritability and anger. The permanent list, people who piss me off, that would be parents and teachers, and then a list for today, all of you, of course. There are also some measures that are provided that can be used as repeated measures. This means that you can give them and track symptom change over time. And they're currently, these are the items where there are current severity measures: depression, separation anxiety for adults, and then a batch for children, self-report. There are also some clinician-rated severity measures that are provided. Again, you can use them to track change in symptom level. The measures, I don't know that I've seen any exceptions, and maybe Susan has, but I haven't. The measures that I've looked at with any closely at all are all based on instruments that have been in the literature for a long time. So for example, the depression one for adults is a PHQ-9, which they've been using in primary care probably for about 20 years, maybe 15 to 20 years. And so they're all based on instruments that are already there. And that's true for kids too? PHQ-7 for kids. So that they're not things that they just kind of thought up and came up with. There may be one or two that are like that, but most of the ones that I've looked at with any detail are based on other things that are in the literature. Here's the one for PTSD. It's based on the National Stressful Events Survey, PTSD short scale. So having flashbacks, and again, almost everything that they do is based on a 5-point rating scale, from 0, not at all the way up to extreme or severe or nearly every day. So that's the symptom severity measures. There's a batch of disability measures. Now, do you guys use the locus? Anybody here use the locus? You're nodding your head sometimes.
That will happen.
Oh, you will be? Oh, good. Well, the locus is for, the state uses this one, okay? So that if I'm talking to people that are working in state programs, then the locus is what they use for disability. What they recommend in the DSM-5 is the World Health Organization Disability Schedule, the WHODAS. All my friends from New Orleans were wishing it was disability table, so it'd be the WHODAT. So this is 36 items, self-administered or a proxy administered, so somebody can report. There's a child version, the WHODAS-C. The thing that's nice about this one is that it looks at disability regardless of the cause. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a visual impairment or a mobility impairment or psychiatric impairment. Whatever it is that limits functioning will be picked up by this. So it's what they look at is functioning, and their cause doesn't make any difference. So this is the one that they recommend, the WHODAS or WHODAS-C. Personality inventories, I'm going to skip that since I didn't do it. Here's the example of the WHODAS. First one is understanding and communicating. Concentrating on doing something for 10 minutes, you know, that tracks impairment in that area. Remembering to do important things if you don't write them down or ask a young person to remind you. So, yeah. That one of the things that they don't have is walking into the other room with something in your hand and you can't remember why. That's one that I think that they should have. Or why am I here? You know, that one. Early development and home background is one of the instruments for parents of children 6 to 17. Cultural formulation. This is actually pretty cool. They have a structured interview to provide information needed to write and develop a cultural formulation. In addition, they have a batch of, I think, 13 supplementary modules. And the supplementary modules go into more detail about specific areas. So there's one on older adults, there's one on immigrants and refugees, there's a spirituality and religion one, there's one about cultural factors in the relationship between the client and the therapist. So they have a batch of these, and again, we've got those. I think the cultural formulation things are in the white book, but so they have a batch of specific cultural formulation things. Now, the question that's occurring to all of you guys is whether, how, and when will any of these be used, and who's going to require it, and quite frankly, it's too early to tell. We don't know. I mean, I haven't heard of people, I've heard of some organizations, some agencies that are looking closely and thinking about incorporating some of these into their practice, but as far as managed care or anybody else, I think it's too early to tell. Here's the cultural formulation. On the left side is the information that you want to get. In the right side is some sample questions. This is how might you ask the question to get at that information. If you go to the website www.psychiatry.org/DSM-5, this is what you'll see. Okay, so on this side, I think it's on the right side, isn't it? Where the corrections, yeah, the right side that's off screen is where they talk about corrections that are made in translation and stuff like that. But here's the table of contents. Here's what you'd find for the assessment measures. Okay, so you click on that, which will take you to this page. Okay, and then you can go right to that particular kind of measure. And when you get there, this is what you're going to see. And all of these are links to PDF files. Okay? All of these are links to PDF files. So, disorder specific for depression, anxiety, phobia, etc. So that's what's there.
The one question Stan didn't ask in the beginning is how many of you have already bought the DSM-5 and are in process of reading it?
Well, wait a minute. There's two questions there.
Okay, how many bought it? Bought it. Okay. And how many of you have already been reading it? All right. The sections of interest to you. Okay. So not that many. All right. I was wondering, gee, if everybody's reading it and bought it, you know, should I be upping something a little bit? Not. I'm assuming, but maybe falsely, so I'm going to check. How many people deal with child and adolescents? Oh, some people do not. So how many do not deal with children? So are you in elderly care, or what do you, just adult care? Adult care. Okay.
Is anybody here from CJE? Anyone working with older adults? No. Okay.
Okay, that's kind of important.
Yeah. They're adults, but not.
But not clinically. Yeah,
All right.
spouses, friends.
Oh, we're not where we need to be. I thought that was cute, so I just flashed it up. Something that you all know then. I mean, the vast majority of people raised their hand and said, children and adolescents is our thing. We work with them. You would know that we base pathology on how far from the developmental norm does a child fall, right? If they're very far from the expected norm, if they haven't achieved the tasks of that age, then we begin to question and we begin to make judgments about, you know, are they functioning okay? Are they distressed? What's happening? Then we get into diagnoses. So what's nice is in DSM-5, this is really explicit. It's threaded throughout the manual. There are references, so you don't have to go back to your developmental textbooks to figure this out. There are references at different points that will say, this is not due to the ordinary problem of eating only specific things when you're 5 years old. How many have raised 5-year-old children? You know, they will go through, a lot of them will go through that period of time where they only eat chicken McNuggets from McDonald's. And that's what they eat. And it doesn't matter what else you do. And that is kind of a developmental stage that they go through, but it's not an eating disorder. So it'll indicate what's due to what. A nice thing, too, is the developmental perspective applies to everyone. We all have. We're all in motion. We're all growing, developing, aging, getting better, getting stronger in certain ways. But we also have tasks at each age that we're supposed to establish and adjust to. And when we're far from the norm, then we should be considered, or somebody helping us should consider what's getting in the way, what's interfering with your development. So it's true for all ages. The developmental norm is important. It assumes then that the diagnosis would fall on a continuum or dimension, so that if we're talking about an anxiety disorder that's seen in young ages, how is it seen across the ages? How is it seen? And how does it come forward? How is it formulated? So within each diagnosis, you'll find a development and course section. So every single diagnosis has one, and you'll find the age at which typical symptoms will present, a detailed symptom presentation specific to each age group, and descriptions of how the presentations change over the lifespan. So let me use ADHD. An adult would not necessarily be driven like a motor. And if we were using that symptom presentation, it wouldn't work. But adults who have the difficulty sitting still in a meeting, the symptoms might be difficulty sitting still in a meeting, difficulty sitting in a restaurant, that kind of thing. So the symptom description would be more relevant per age, okay? And are some people wiggling around now, laughing? Yeah. Or how something might change over the lifespan. So let me say generalized anxiety disorder in a kid like 8, 9, 10, they're concerned with operations, and they would be concerned with performance and worry about a lot of things. An older adult, the worries of an older adult age is health. So their generalized anxiety would be seen around health and physical concerns. So there's also a trajectory for most disorders. They'll talk about where the disorder is going. So disorders are seen as fluid. They move from one point to another. We kind of have already known that. If you're working with children and adolescents, they'll come to you with one presentation, but they've already had another disorder that's sort of in motion. Sometimes one is morphing into another. So it lets you know what's going to happen over time. And that was not in DSM-4TR. Risks and prognostic factors. We all know temperament is important. We've all got one, right? A temperament is not a disorder. You're born that way. But some temperaments will correlate more with various disorders than others. So initially, the task force in DSM-5 was thinking about using behavioral inhibition, which is a temperament, and some of you here may have that temperament. It's the more anxious temperament, when a child really needs a lot of preparation for something, and they'll come to a body of water, but before they get in the pool, they're going to tap their toes in, and they're going to get in very slowly. If we consider that temperament may be associated with an anxiety disorder later, that a child may be vulnerable for that, then maybe we would be looking to do something early to prevent an anxiety disorder. So the task force with DSM-5 was thinking, well, why don't we just make that a very low, a mild form of an anxiety disorder? And there really was a lot of like, gee, it would be good for prevention. They decided not to do that because it over-pathologized children. Was not a good thing. But we should be looking for that in the descriptions. Under the risk and prognostic factors, they will talk about temperament being risk factors. We already know about genetics and physiological factors that would be a risk. Descriptions of situations associated with each age group in which the disorder would disrupt normal functioning. A situation for an adolescent with separation anxiety disorder might be a little girl who's on the cheerleading squad. Well, they have those cheerleading camps, and they have to go away for a week and sleep. That would be a time that would disrupt normal functioning. Okay? Long-term outcome, what do we expect? What are some points of increased risk for the disorder to get worse? And what are some modifiers that would help make it better? It considers contextual factors, which is very, very highly focused with our population, youth. One teacher makes a big difference, you know. One group of peers makes a big difference, can make things much worse or much better. And things are not the same from year to year. Child can have a terrible year. The next year, great year. What's the difference? Context. Okay. So, okay. There also is recognition that enabling parents, which we know, enabling parents as compared to non-enabling parents, if parents are overprotective and a child is kind of scared about talking to peers going to school, well, we'll just fix that. We'll just drive you to school. Okay, great. So the disorder will continue and will get worse, right? The associated features, this is really much broader than in the DSM-4TR. Much more comprehensive information. I'm particularly happy with some of the medical things that are in. If you deal with eating disorders, you're also dealing with medical associations, dental associations. They're very, very important. And those things are included in the associated features. There are some disorders that have parent-child associations. Panic disorder and separation anxiety disorder kind of go together. With females, mom to daughter, that would be mentioned in DSM-5. Functional consequences, I think Stan already mentioned, and I have too. The comorbidity section is enormous, and what's nice is that you can diagnose, in some instances, you can diagnose two disorders together that were not allowed to be diagnosed together in DSM-4TR. So they allow many more comorbidities. Developmental manifestations is part of the criteria. I kind of mentioned that, but okay. Cell phones, losing cell phones, ADHD, inattentive type would be teens, right? Okay. And this is cool. Procedures for evaluating developmental subtypes of disorders. This is the first time that I have ever read a DSM in all my 65 years that actually refers to using your clinical judgment. That was lovely. Aha, we have clinical judgment. Wonderful. So there'll be reference to, if you're not sure of this or this, then think about the patterns that are supposed to go with them and, you know, piece it together, do a good diagnostic interview, and come up with your best clinical judgment. Lovely. Aha, so we meet again. There's a new section. My apologies, I don't think you have this slide. So the neurodevelopmental disorders is a new section that basically replaces the disorders first seen in infancy and early childhood. Not completely, though. There are some that have moved out, some that have been renamed, but I like it because I've always been a little confused with trying to discriminate things and get a good diagnosis with young children. And it does include those that have multiple beginnings and multiple trajectories. And these disorders happen in the early developmental period. You know, intellectual issues happen early, physical, motor coordination, language development problems, relational problems, and use of language in social situations. They've always developed early in life. And frequently you will see this in the developmental period. I think did I put something there? Yes, early developmental period. In DSM-5, it frequently doesn't say what that means. You know, it's not like we're considering the early developmental period between the first month of life and age 3. It doesn't. Specific disorders will say you can't diagnose before this age, or, you know, like a language disorder, you couldn't diagnose it before the age of 4 because between 3 and 4, the brain is like wired to be very fertile for words, and thousands of words are learned between age 3 and 4. So you don't want to do anything until they're at least 4, right? Okay. And those of you who deal, a lot of you, I think, deal with the autistic spectrum. I saw a lot of hands go up. And, you know, we're really wanting to get that show on the road by the age of 2, get that diagnosis so we can get some good accommodations, not just to get a diagnosis, but to get some good accommodations. All right. They frequently co-occur, ADHD and learning issues, etc. They do. And there are a couple new things. So here we go. Where do you find them? Since a lot of you haven't purchased the DSM-5 yet, you may be looking like, oh, you know, where is conduct disorder and oppositional defiant? And what did they do with the elimination disorders? And what did they do? So this is what they did. Some disorders in DSM-4, like mental retardation, the 3 learning disorders, developmental coordination, and ADHD were among them. They're under neurodevelopmental disorders with some changes. Mental retardation has been renamed to intellectual disability with some criteria changes, and I'll get into that. The 3 learning disorders in DSM-4 were the disorder of reading, written expression, and math. They've reduced it to 1 disorder, specific learning disorder. The reason for that is with almost all children that I've seen, and apparently that the task force saw too, they have at least 2. They kind of go together. They'll have a reading and math one, or they'll have a math and writing one, or reading and writing. They'll have 2 together. So they thought, why not just make it a specifier? It is a specific learning disorder, and then you just specify what the learning problem is. Developmental coordination is exactly the same. ADHD has some modifications that I'll get into in a few moments. Communication disorders, I don't even know how many deal with that or not. How many deal with expressive language disorder and the receptive? You do? Okay. Good. This is the first group that actually cared about that. I always had some yeah, it's nice, so I can talk.
No, they didn't say they cared, they said they don't.
that even use it, that even have used the diagnosis, even, right? So for those of you who don't, language, to boil it down into something really basic, we all get information from what we hear, see, or sense, touch, physical. And we put that information inside, and then we process that information. And then we show what we know by the words we say or the gestures or the movement that we get it. And in DSM-4-TR, it was broken down into the expressive end and the receptive expressive. It was really too difficult to have those be two separate disorders. It was very hard to teach in graduate school. My students would always get it confused, and I had trouble writing the questions for their exams. So I'm so glad that they really reduced it to just one thing. Both are subsumed, the expressive and the mixed expressive receptive, to one diagnosis: language disorder. Stuttering has just been renamed, and it's so easy to remember. Child onset fluency disorder. If you're stuttering, you're not fluent, right? Very easy. Phonologic disorder always dealt with troubles that the child had with the sounds of speech, so they've made it speech sound disorder. Just easier. What they did do with the motor sections and the tics is they just added specifiers, with or without self-injury, which is important. Important description and distinction for intervention too. And they've added associated with other known disorder or medical, if there's a medical causation. Yeah. This is the big one. The big one has been the pervasive, yeah.
Just a question about the learning disorders.
Yes.
So previous, like with the DSM-4, we've been using learning disorder NOS for kids who had a learning disorder that wasn't captured by like reading disorder, like kids who had nonverbal learning disorders. Right?
You would probably then use the either other specified or other unspecified if you don't know yet, and you haven't.
If we know, like this is a situation where we know, we've done testing, so we know. What would you recommend?
I would probably put it under an other specified, and you would indicate why it doesn't meet. Indicate why it doesn't meet the criteria for that particular. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's what I would do. All right. Onward to the biggie. The pervasive developmental disorders were really collapsed into one: autistic spectrum disorder. Rets, for a long time, we've known that Rets is it's a genetic mutation. So it really should never have been a mental disorder. It is in DSM-5 as a specifier with known medical problems, Rets, but it's not a mental disorder. I'll go into a lot of why that is true later. Separation anxiety disorder and selective mutism, in keeping with the dimensional approach and the fluidity of diagnosis over time, that's been moved into with adult anxiety disorders. Pica, rumination disorder, feeding disorder of infancy. I have always taught that under a feeding and eating disorders because I thought, well, it should be under that. Well, they've made a new section called feeding and eating disorders where pica, rumination disorder, and anorexia, bulimia, it's all in one feeding and eating disorder umbrella. And they have added a new eating disorder called the restrictive food intake disorder. It replaces the feeding disorder of infancy, but with a few changes in conceptualization. That the old feeding disorder of infancy and the pica rumination disorder, there was much emphasis on parent-child and out of sync, parent-child out of sync. The restrictive food intake disorder still is where you don't get enough nutrients. And that was the basis of the feeding disorder of infancy. Yeah. Failure to thrive. Failure to thrive, like they had NOFT, and failure to thrive is determined by medical, and so that would be a medical diagnosis, but seems to be a subsection of a feeding. Yes, it does, doesn't it? There's been debates as to whether both should fall under the umbrella of NOFT, or whether NOFT should fall under the umbrella of a feeding and eating disorder. We don't know, but we still define our diagnosis, our mental health diagnosis, by the social aspects of the problem, the social emotional aspects, rather than purely the medical definition. Okay, I don't know if that helps, but it wasn't really, that was not changed significantly in DSM-5. Yeah. What they have added with the restrictive food intake, though, is it's more of the selective issues. I had this as a child, and I think I still have some of this left, but I get my nutrients, so I don't qualify for the diagnosis. And I've always gotten my nutrients. Does anybody have like consistency issues, that the feel, the sensory issues of food bother you? Like for me, mushrooms, I wouldn't eat something, clams. As a kid, even the taste of certain utensils bothered me. I had this spoon that I liked and the fork that I liked, and I would not eat with the other things. So way too much information about me for you. But, or asparagus can taste kind of sandy to me. But the children who have a lot more of those, where they can't get enough food, okay, then they would qualify for that. All right, and I'll finish this, and then maybe, I know we need a bathroom break soon. The reactive attachment disorder, ho, 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 we knew this should happen. It has been moved to trauma and stress-related disorders. A no-brainer. I mean, I think you'll find a lot of things in DSM-5 that those of us who work with children and adolescents will be so thankful for this. It's kind of like the kids aren't just put off into a little bit of a like, well, we can just adjust this down for a child. It's not that way. Children are really included in the whole population, and things you've known all along that you waited for so many years for another DSM, yeah, there it is. It's there, so you will know. And caprices and enuresis have been moved to their own section. There is a separate section called elimination disorders. So they are all alone. And I can see why. The conduct disorder, oppositional, defiant, and intermittent explosive disorder has their own section. The disruptive impulse control and conduct disorder. So that's where you find those guys. That's just the list of what I went through. And I think this would be a good time then for a break, right? Is it 10 minutes that we take?
Yeah, take 10 minutes.
Take 10 minutes. So I've